again to the January meeting of the Socratic Club. The Gonzaga Socratic Club takes its inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club in Oxford in the mid-1900s. It was presided over by Christian apologist C.S. Lewis, and we address Christian worldview issues, including questions about Gonzaga's Jesuit Catholic mission. That's a topic that we've addressed on a number of occasions before. I started to count on our website archive how many times we've talked about mission, but I didn't. So you can look there sometime if you want to have the answer. We can make that a quiz for next time. How many times have we talked about mission? We are going to be talking today about Jesuit and Catholic in Gonzaga's Jesuit Catholic Humanist mission. Our main speaker is Professor Tom Jeannot of Gonzaga's philosophy department. His BA degree is from St. Louis University in 1978. His PhD, which I have to say he didn't finish until after I came here, was 1992. Tom is famous for having written a gigantic PhD dissertation that took him quite some time to finish. But it's really appropriate that Tom should be speaking on this topic because there's a sense in which he's Jesuit to the core. He is family of Seattle University, and he studied here at St. Michael's Institute in the...
And you studied at St. Louis. Well, I was here 1 year, 75, 76.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then St. Louis University. So he has studied at Jesuit universities and knows them pretty well inside out. He's spoken for the Socratic Club on a couple of occasions before. In 2010, he spoke on secularization, and back in 2005, he spoke on pacifism. So he's now adding his voice to, as I said, this topic that we've addressed a number of times here at the Socratic Club on mission. And we have as commentator today another person who is very well positioned to comment on Jesuit Catholic mission here at Gonzaga. Father Tim Clancy is a member of the philosophy department and director of the honors program and a member of the Society of Jesus. So that puts him in a good place to do that. So Gonzaga's mission and identity are, by universal admission, a key part of what makes Gonzaga the place that it is, although it's a subject that is a matter of dispute and controversy. And increasingly, it's my contention, I don't know if Professor Jeannot would agree with me about this, but increasingly when a subject like mission becomes the topic of controversy, it often means that there's significant disagreement or dispute about what the mission is. And that means that we do have to have a conversation. Indeed, President Thane McCullough has invited us to a conversation about what the meaning of mission and identity at Gonzaga University are. And Professor Tom Jeannot is going to answer that charge. So, welcome, Tom Jeannot.
Thank you. Might as well get that out of the way now. I trap myself into writing a longer paper than I can read. So I left out a lot of the fun parts. And it's called Catholic and Jesuit at Gonzaga. It's a Catholic, Jesuit, humanist tradition towards a critical theory. When President McCullough distributed the statement of affirmation concerning Gonzaga University as a Jesuit university, he challenged us in his letter to Gonzaga colleagues to read it carefully, keeping in mind the question, what does it mean to work at a Jesuit university? The norm he proposed is that if we are to be a Jesuit university, it will be because each member of our community understands and makes manifest our identity and mission in the daily work she or he does. My purpose in writing is to keep the President's question in mind in its intellectual component for the faculty whose primary obligation is teaching. As a pluralist, I'm taking it for granted the rich diversity of possible answers, aware that I speak only for myself. And I'll start with Martha Nussbaum. In Socrates and the Religious University, a chapter in Cultivating Humanity, Nussbaum favorably contrasts Notre Dame with Brigham Young. Her purpose in writing is to elaborate the integral relation between liberal education and citizenship in a democratic society. In the light of this relation, Nussbaum is oriented by her normative commitment to what she calls our liberal democratic tradition. She writes that this tradition views itself not as the enemy of religion, but as its vigilant protector. It is precisely because religious faith is so important to people that our tradition makes freedom of conscience and religious exercise a non-negotiable part of American life. It's a lot of quotation, and presumably you'll know when I'm quoting and when I'm not. In order to frame her pro-Notre Dame argument, she affiliates her outlook with Pope John Paul II, taking her epigraph from John Paul II's address to the United Nations General Assembly in 1995. The Pope said that to cut oneself off from the reality of difference, or worse, to attempt to stamp out that difference, is to cut oneself off from the possibility of sounding the depths of the mystery of human life. Nussbaum quotes him twice more. She writes, "We should begin by taking very seriously the Pope's warning. It seems plausible to think that a truly religious life should be open to humanity in all of its cultural forms. As the Pope stated, quote, our respect for the culture of others is rooted in our respect for each community's attempt to answer the question of human life. Every culture has something to teach us about that complex truth. Thus, the difference, which some find so threatening, can, through respectful dialogue, become the source of a deeper understanding of the mystery of human existence," end quote. In addition to our identification with the Holy Father's philosophically and theologically grounded multiculturalism and his inclusive universalism, Nussbaum next quotes him to demonstrate the convergence of her own liberal democratic tradition with his UN address. And here is Nussbaum quoting John Paul again. "The implicit rationale for this special treatment of religion seems to be that to ask people to go along with the religious custom for any reasons other than those given by their own conscience would be to violate their humanity at its very core. The Pope stressed this idea in his United Nations address. Our respect for humanity shows us, quote, how important it is to safeguard the fundamental right to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience as the cornerstones of the structure of human rights and the foundation of every truly free society," end quote. I believe Nussbaum's affiliation with John Paul II is earnestly meant, and not simply a deft way, to bring her own criteria into play in her comparative assessment of Notre Dame and BYU. These are 1, study of non-Western cultures, 2, ethnic minority studies, 3, women's studies, and 4, homosexuality. Writing in 1997, she scores Notre Dame higher than BYU in every category, but she does not leave it unscathed. At the same time, Nussbaum, raised Episcopalian and a convert to conservative Judaism, coming to the question of Catholic identity as an outsider looking in, takes it for granted that as the flagship of Catholic universities in the U.S., Notre Dame is palpably and undeniably Catholic. First, she understands that Shaw's quip that a Catholic university is a contradiction in terms may be clever, but it's untrue. Second, she grasps by understatement that Roman Catholicism is well placed, theologically, to establish a religious university that is both truly religious and truly a university. She writes that our Catholic tradition gives learning and inquiry pride of place in its account of a worthwhile human life. She quotes Cardinal Newman and portrays Dante's encomium in the Paradiso to his mentor, St. Thomas Aquinas. Third, she quotes from Notre Dame's mission statement. Its very Catholic character presupposes that no genuine search for the truth in the human or cosmic order is alien to the life of faith. This is the point she understates, not merely the compatibility, but the mutual entailments of the life of reason and the life of faith, which, in a related context, led me to write of one characteristic expression of the Catholic intellectual tradition by way of Lonergan's affirmation of the complete intelligibility of being. Just at this juncture, Nussbaum's status as an outsider looking in is confirmed by her self-disclosure. Hers is the liberal democratic tradition according to her own self-understanding. John Paul II's is the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is partly convergent and partly distinct. If one were to profess agnosticism as to which tradition is Gonzaga's, one would belong to an agnostic tradition. What Hans-Georg Gadamer, Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, Hubert Dreyfus, Clifford Geertz, Paul Ravenel, the interpretive social scientists of Berkeley affiliated with Robert Bellah and others have shown is that the human animal cannot help but be a traditionary animal. It is never a question of whether one belongs or does not belong to a tradition. It is a question of what Paul Ricoeur called the conflict of interpretations and what Gadamer characterized as the ongoing dialectical tension between belonging on the one hand and alienating distanciation on the other. Concerning tradition, then, my thesis is that, by definition, we belong to the Catholic intellectual tradition expressed as a normative commitment from the highest level of institutional authority in the statement of affirmation. In order to develop this thesis, I have to operate with a criteriology quite different from Nussbaum's, which I am not opposing but merely setting aside in order to take another point of departure concerning the matter of the internal form with respect to our traditions, which an outsider looking in would not be expected to engage. But to turn to Nussbaum once more, she rightly quotes Dean Harold Attridge's address to the faculty of Notre Dame's College of Arts and Letters in 1993. Attridge said, "The identity of Notre Dame grows out of two paradigmatic narratives. The story of Jesus, which gives the university its elusive and yet compelling vision of a realm of peace and justice, and the story of Socrates." Nussbaum names the integration of these narratives Catholic Socratism. Her evidence that a Catholic Socratism characterizes the curriculum of Notre Dame is that, quote, all Notre Dame undergraduates, in addition to other liberal arts requirements, must take 2 theology and 2 philosophy courses, end quote. This is Nussbaum's tacit admission of what I almost feel embarrassed to call the privilege of theology and philosophy on the campus of a Catholic university, precisely by virtue of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Here I leave out a gloss on Alain Badiou's critique of Gilles Deleuze and the clamor of being. How this possibly abstruse matter of whether the universe of meaning and being is a clamor or a unity and multiplicity, how it bears on the identity and mission of a Catholic and Jesuit, and therefore also a humanist university, is actually not hard to see. As it is operationalized within our lives at work, in their intellectual component and its translation into the curriculum, the Catholic intellectual tradition includes a trademark brought to light, once again, recently by Alistair MacIntyre in God, Philosophy, Universities, A Selective History of the Catholic Philosophical Tradition, 2009. For simplicity's sake, let's say that what's at issue is the difference between a university and a multiversity, McIntyre writes, "What is true of history and physics in contemporary American universities is also true of theology and philosophy. They too have become almost exclusively specialized and professionalized disciplines. To whom then in such a university falls the task of integrating the various disciplines, of considering the bearing of each on the others, and of asking how each contributes to the overall understanding of the nature and order of things? The answer is no one, but even this answer is misleading. For there is no sense in the contemporary American university that there is such a task, that something that matters is being left undone. And so the very notion of the nature and order of things, of a single universe, different aspects of which are objects of inquiry for the various disciplines, but in such a way that each aspect needs to be related to every other, this notion no longer informs the enterprise of the contemporary American university. It has become an irrelevant concept," so says McIntyre. McIntyre's point is obviously true of institutions of post-secondary education without a core curriculum. The very raison d'etre of a core in the first place is the integration of which McIntyre writes and which Lonergan names reflective self-appropriation. The deep premise or the condition of its possibility is the twofold statement, A, that no genuine search for the truth in the human or cosmic order is alien to the life of faith, and B, that within the complementarity of faith and reason, a being is completely intelligible. Therefore, when the next question comes, what sort of core, here at Gonzaga we can swiftly answer that it must be one that belongs to the Catholic intellectual tradition, where not only has it never become an irrelevant concept, but where it has been enshrined as the integral aim of the very idea of the university. The relation between a core and a tradition is an unavoidable internal relation. For an illustration of what difference this might make, we can think once more of Nussbaum's self-positioning in the liberal democratic tradition, when she aligns herself with the crucial point of convergence on John Paul II's UN address. But her convergence is with another tradition, the one to which Gonzaga belongs. Thus, Nussbaum rises to the defense of the Catholic University as a Catholic Socratism, but at the end of the day, her criteria for judgment can be easily recognized as secularized values, as true of Eastern Washington University as here. They are secularized precisely because they are distinct from any explicitly religious commitments and indifferent to any particular religious signifiers, whether by virtue of a doctrine of liberal tolerance, or a studied agnosticism, or a lived atheism, or an articulate one. After the Second Vatican Council, at least, this is not an argument against a secular order per se. The distinction belonging to Christianity between the secular and the sacred is ancient, but against secularism as a doctrine or an ideology, and against the aspects of secularization as a process that imply a desacralization or desacramentalization, as well as a depersonalization of reality, both lived and theoretical. Nussbaum's liberal democratic tradition and the Catholic intellectual tradition are convergent but distinct. With John Courtney Murray as Jay's Catholic liberalism of the 60s, Nussbaum's interpretation of liberalism is a vigilant protector of religion. But the term liberalism belongs to other meanings and interpretations as well. The closer the term liberalism is, as an outlook, an ideology, or a worldview, to the term secularism as a synonym, also as an outlook, an ideology, or a worldview, the further it is away from the Catholic intellectual tradition. The Catholic intellectual tradition embraces the secular, but it is religious rather than secular, replete with the concrete dialectical images that render it palpably Catholic, and drawing from a plenum of conceptual signs, symbols, concepts, categories, and interpretations that render its particular, historically grounded, intellectual dimension concrete and determinate. It is worth noticing how alike are the concerns MacIntyre confronts in 2009 to the ones Newman confronted in founding the Catholic University in Dublin in the middle of the 19th century. As Martin J. Svaglich writes in his introduction to the idea of the university, Newman's idea entails a critique of secularism, utilitarian specialization, and another version of liberalism defined as, quote, the view that there is no substantive truth in religion, which is largely a matter of sentiment or feeling, concerning which, therefore, one man's opinion is pretty much as good as another's, end quote. This disposition is not unknown within the antinomian strains of Christianity, but where confessional differences matter, it is essentially inimical to the Catholic intellectual tradition. It seems fair to think that the research university founded in the second half of the 19th century has metamorphosed into the multiversity of siloed specializations today, with respect to which it does matter to us that MacIntyre's Catholic task cannot become irrelevant. The history of Catholic universities in the United States has always been a counterpoint to the vicious and insidious aspects of the secularization process by way of being the conservator of its own living tradition. In order to see what difference this might make to us now, I think we can begin by taking a step beyond MacIntyre. If, with respect to intentionality, the answer is no one, for the deeper reason that there's nothing to ask about, then it wouldn't be as if the multiversity had no center of gravity and no mission at all. Rather, its mission, disenchanted in Weber's sense, might be characterized today by two characteristics, implicitly if not explicitly operative, namely physicalism and economism. If this were so, then my argument would lead to the conclusion that neither physicalism nor economism, nor the interrelations between them, is consistent with the Catholic intellectual tradition we aim to transmit, to renew by way of ongoing renewal, and to adapt to ever-changing circumstances, not by self-forfeiture, but by reading the signs of the times. A tradition is a living tradition if it addresses itself to the vital needs and concerns of living women and men. But as MacIntyre has argued, to be living, a tradition needs to have this capacity in the first place, a capacity for self-renewal that stands open to critical and reflective self-correction in each generation and age, in part through ongoing arguments. Grave mistakes are made, foul turns are taken, but Catholicism has demonstrated its resilience and vitality for 2 millennia across epoch-making and revolutionary transformations, ever transforming and converting itself along the way. In the fundamental aspects, it has not lost its bearings. Its most durable qualities would be subject to recognition all along the way, as they are stated in the statement of affirmation. A, the complementarity of faith and reason. B, the importance of intellectual community and dialogue. C, an incarnational and sacramental vision of the world through the lens of the incarnation of the divine in the humanity of Christ. D, whole person education. E, emphasis on humanistic liberal education. And F, concern for prophetic witness and service. 2 traditions may therefore be on a collision course in fundamental ways. The Catholic intellectual tradition surely cannot yield to physicalism and economism. Speaking only for myself, I would locate these features of the secularization process in a Marxian critical theoretical framework. But I won't attempt it here. It is by no means a brief for censorship. It is only to observe a difference in worldviews when it would be foolish to deny that some among them could be mutual antagonists in adversarial relations. We can move most straightforwardly to what's at stake for us in the physicalist worldview as an intellectual and curricular matter by considering Catholic teaching concerning the soul. The basic approach of contemporary analytic metaphysics does not capture the ancient and medieval understanding of it, where the most salient and resilient contemporary approaches to the constitution of the human animal have been phenomenological and hylomorphic, as exemplified by John Paul II's own personalist Thomism, or by the integral humanism of Jacques Maritain, or the metaphysics of creative fidelity of Gabriel Marcel. By virtue of an Ignatian composition of plays, I am compelled to recall that the relevant questions cannot be avoided in the course in the curriculum that is their singular opportunity to appear. In view of a caution about a truncated, diminished universe of meaning and being, I imagine that there will be a proliferation of ways in which the underlying issue of vital existential importance might be broached and considered. It's not only the question of how spirituality is to be understood, that is, the evident spirituality of the human animal, but it is also the question of how personhood is to be understood. And outside of religious studies and philosophy, no other disciplines in the university have a mandate to see these questions through by way of an explicit representation of what the Catholic intellectual tradition holds. But what if it happened to be the case that implicitly or by default, the trend in the university were to reinforce, consolidate, and motivate what might be called a physicalist self-understanding, if that's not an oxymoron, in a context in which methodological naturalism increasingly becomes the most natural way to think about what must really be going on, and increasingly for everyone alike in society and culture. The danger for us would be that the imago Dei would be broadly bypassed, ignored, or translated into secular terms so thin that even the lowest Christology would have to stoop down. Within the Catholic intellectual tradition, that we are created in the image and likeness of God is the basic anthropological self-understanding. This is what we believe. This is what we are seeking to understand. And if the Catholic intellectual tradition is present in the core curriculum and its rationale, then the signs of A through E above would be pervasive as the fulfilling conditions of our aspiration to F, prophetic witness and service. When it comes to the question of a worldview, as it must, the public place of the Catholic intellectual tradition is the campus of the Catholic University. In his preface to the Catholic University as Promise and Project, Reflections in a Jesuit Idiom, Michael J. Buckley, S.J., starts out again from Newman. Newman held as axiomatic that the Catholic University, like any university, bore as its determining goal this cultivation of the intellect. It was a cultivation that made discriminating convictions possible. Students graduating from universities without this liberal education and the unity of mind it imparted were forever impoverished. They possess, quoting Newman, no principles laid down within them as a foundation for the intellect to build upon. They have no discriminating convictions and no grasp of consequence, end quote. Buckley's appeal to Newman in his preface to a definition of the Catholic University, together with its entailments, implications, and consequences, then he offers his definition, which I'm compelled to quote at length. If I knew anything about technology, it'd be on the overhead behind me. The Catholic University is to realize the intrinsic relationship of culture and gospel in the many ways in which it is a university. How is such a university Catholic? The university is Catholic above all in its deliberate determination to render the church and the broader world this unique service. To be an intellectual community wherein utter academic freedom, the variant lines of Catholic tradition and thought can intersect with all forms of human culture, with the most complex resources, challenges, contradictions, and reinforcements of contemporary thought. and can move towards a reflective unity in the knowledge and habits of the students, in the direction of faculty research, and in the vital interchange of the academic community between human culture and the self-revelation of God. These do not simply intersect. One brings the other to its completion. The Catholic University exists to deepen the unity between Christian faith and all forms of knowledge. No other institution within human culture can render this unique and critically important contribution to the Church and to the contemporary world. Here, in its purpose, lies its meaning and its urgency. That's Michael Buckley. Buckley follows this definition with a remark on the controversies about ex corde ecclesiae, on which I comment in turn, but I'll bypass this part for now. He concludes that to cite such a critique as his own anti-authoritarian one as grounds for denying a sympathetic hearing to its central summons would be tragic. This voice and this summons to a more definitive understanding of the Catholic University deserves to be heard. To me, this is the point to make in 2014, where the important emphasis would fall on the Apostolic Constitution's insistence on, quote, the unitive functions of the university, the integration of the disciplines with the aid of philosophy and theology, the dialogic integration between faith and reason, both bearing witness to the unity of truth, the unity of the ethical and scientific, and the synthetic function of theology. I've turned to the Imago Dei, Christ as Paradigm, Newman, McIntyre, and Buckley, against the backdrop of a possible danger in the rise and development of a worldview fundamentally inconsistent with and even inimical to it. In some well-publicized cases, even hostility, a disposition of mockery and ridicule. I named a conceivable threat from the worldview of physicalism, which it can be argued is increasingly present on the campus of American universities, a threat to the Imago Dei and Christ as the paradigm. I'll turn next to the second characteristic I identified with the vicious or insidious aspects of the secularization process, namely economism. Here I've cut out a discussion of John Mowatt's article, The Humanities and the University in Ruin, and he's a lefty, by the way, appearing in Lateral, the Journal of the Cultural Studies Association, in the spring of 2012. Mowatt's starting point is an essay by Mahmoud Mamdani, director of Uganda's Makerere Institute of Social Research and author of The Importance of Research in the University, which appeals to critical engagement as a way to think about what is distinctive to research that is humanistic. I will not linger here nor on the implications for social justice and Catholic social teaching, except to take my leave from Mowat. Towards his conclusion, reflecting on Hegel's figure of the labor of the negative, Mowat expresses the sentiment that Hegel's figure, quote, invites a necessary embrace of human finitude that risks desecularizing the humanities in a rather unhelpful way, end quote. That is, Mowat's rationale for the humanities, from within his own tradition of cultural studies, must be secular, since human finitude is necessarily the basic human situation. The dilemma for Mowat is how to embrace it within the secularization process. Whereas I take it, the alternative of the Catholic intellectual tradition must be desecularizing, in the sense in which I've sought to clarify it, with particular respect to a secularizing indifference to religious signifiers. I personally would seek out another way to bring our own tradition into play, which has been the lifelong work of my mentor, James L. Marsh, emeritus professor at Fordham, who mediates a Marxian humanism through the medium of his own theology of liberation to the Catholic intellectual tradition. For our purposes now, we can say that the centerpiece of Marsh's process, praxis, and transcendence, profoundly informed by the thought of Bernard Lonergan, is his presentation of Jesus Christ liberated. To me, this is only one conceivable way, among an untold variety of ways, of working within the Catholic intellectual tradition and also bringing it into the respectful dialogue John Paul II urged with every artifact of our humanity. Notre Dame's mission statement is also Catholic, too, when it appropriates the pagan Roman playwright Terence, I consider nothing that is human, alien to me. In order to retain our focus on the explicit question of identity, mission, and tradition, we can come to another aspect under the same heading of economism without ever mentioning either Marx or liberation theology. And this is the fun part, so I was hustling to get to this part of the brief. In fact, we can come right up to Gonzaga's doorstep by considering George Critchlow. For those of you who don't know him, he's a professor of law at the law school here at Gonzaga. And he's written this article called Kim Kardashian and Honey Boo Boo, Models for Law School Success or Not. And I think he originally wanted to title it Kim Kardashian and Honey Boo Boo Go to Law School. And it appeared in the Connecticut Law Review just this past May. This is serious satire. Critchlow argues that when the first rule is follow the money, the most absurd aspects of celebrity culture have an analog in the law school. Law schools achieve fame by being nationally recognized and ranked. The czar of rankings is U.S. News and World Report, which surveys star lawyers, star judges, and star educators to work out the tiers on the basis of star-studded scores. It is generally the case that what Critchlow calls the tyranny of rankings is a tyrant over other mission-based concerns that one might have thought were more important than being famous. Critchlow writes, "The truth is that most constituents, alumni, faculty, students, administrators, and university board members are uncomfortable with the prospect that their stated mission will obstruct their true mission of becoming nationally known. In the law school world, being a national school is tantamount to being famous. So why not just eliminate the conflict between mission statement and practice by stating that a school's mission is to become famous? This is more honest and streamlined than the pretense and obfuscation sometimes occasions when mission rhetoric does not comport with action." Critchlow continues, "Some may believe this discussion is simply meant to be satirical, maybe even funny. Would it not be humorous to suggest that the law schools are driven by the values and goals of a Hollywood public relations agency? Well, not necessarily. If a law school's real interest is to get attention, to raise its national profile, and to be ranked higher by U.S. News and World Report, and if that interest overrides all else, it would be therapeutic, honest, ethical, and more efficient simply to admit it and get on with whatever it is necessary to make it happen." Citing an article in the Wall Street Journal about Gonzaga to punctuate his point, he writes that educators, students, and alumni prefer fame over other possible mission orientation is abundantly demonstrated in the world of sports. The sports world validates the proposition that national recognition and fame are important for educational institutions. Certainly that is the case at my own university, Gonzaga University, where the school's national profile has gone up in direct proportion to the fame garnered by its basketball program. This past fall semester, towards the end of the term, I asked my students in 2 sections of ethics, now that they'd been here for a while, why Gonzaga? They gave critical, thoughtful, and reflective answers, but they did not fail to report that they were Zags and belonged to Zag Nation. The theme of community was resonant around the classroom, but it wouldn't be too far afield to say that for many of them, the principle of community at Gonzaga is the kennel club. We're Zags too, but we don't miss Critchlow's point. And what I take to be his most withering kind, Critchlow tells the truth like this. In any event, the argument that it is impossible for all law schools to be famous misses the point. Most schools already want to be famous and they act accordingly, even though false modesty prevents them from publicly acknowledging the fact. They should simply talk the walk by explicitly and transparently embracing the mission of becoming famous. Their mission statement should proudly trumpet the real mission. This step alone would be liberating, intoxicating, and self-fulfilling. I've only got like just a couple pages to go. Will you please bear with me?
Go for it.
The extension of Critchlow's argument from the law school to the rest of the university is ready to hand in the reference to the perceived importance of rankings in U.S. News and World Report. 4 Jesuit universities, including Gonzaga, annually count in the top 10 regional best, which we publicize far and wide. But when we consider the Department of Philosophy, for example, the czar of rankings is Brian Leiter's Philosophical Gourmet, which ranks graduate programs at English-speaking university institutions based primarily on the quality of the faculty. Gonzaga doesn't come within a country mile of Brian Leiter's ranking criteria. This is not necessarily because we are second-rate and inferior, but because we work with a different metaphilosophical conception of the nature of our work on a Catholic and Jesuit campus. In the nature of the case, we practice mission-centered hierarchy. And to the best of my knowledge, we're not worried about fame or star power, which we happily leave to the zags. As I mentioned earlier, Catholic philosophy departments in the U.S. have always, although not unambiguously, constituted themselves as a minority tradition within the dominant and even hegemonic style of working out famous philosophy in the United States. Wondering whether another path is viable that really would be a practice of fidelity to a mission other than rankings, Critchlow goes on to offer some examples. The one Catholic law school he singles out is St. Mary's School of Law in San Antonio, the oldest Catholic law school in the American Southwest. A faith-based, fourth-tier school that admits a large number of minority students, managed to keep its tuition relatively low, and admits lower LSAT students who perform very well on the Texas bar. Critchlow concludes by laying out 10 strategies to escape the tyranny of rankings. Rankings are the educational equivalent of fame, fame is star power, and all stars negotiate the cash nexus. By this logic, Kim Kardashian wins hands down, Lonergan's general bias of common sense is fully in play, and fundamental and principled considerations stand at risk of being foregone in favor of the flattery of the age and the need to be famous. My purpose in writing could not be to call for an imposition, the disciplinary power of a regime of truth, or any sort of restriction on anyone's academic freedom. To quote Nussbaum again, interpreting John Paul II, to ask people to go along with the religious custom for any reasons other than those given by their own conscience would be to violate their humanity at its very core. Whatever steps we take to quicken and vitalize the Catholic intellectual tradition on our campus must be done from our own volition and desire to transform it into a corporate act. If I had to start all over again and restrain myself to making only one recommendation, it would be to commend the American Catholic novelist Walker Percy's Jefferson lecture of May 3rd, 1989, The San Andreas Fault in the Modern Mind, and this is despite the fact that Lynn Cheney introduces him, Percy's profound meditation on the human significance of the seminal American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce's theory of signs, especially theories. It is a brilliant refutation of any view that would find our basic humanity in the powerful, seductive, and pervasive metaphor of the machine and the machine mind. As such, it opens the door to a way of conceiving ourselves beyond the physicalism and economism that I have argued are endemic features of the process of secularization. I would choose to stand in a light like this as I consider the baccalaureate learning goals canonically integrated into the statement of affirmation. What is at issue in response to the President's invitation and mandate is precisely our way of proceeding at work in the curriculum in order to assure our authentic branding as a university within the Catholic intellectual tradition. I foresee exciting possibilities ahead. For example, a deep infiltration of the Catholic intellectual tradition into the first-year seminar and senior capstone courses, a public recognition of the privilege of philosophy and theology in the teaching of ethics as moral philosophy and as moral theology, and many ways to achieve the mandated interdisciplinarity of a kind that promotes the cultivation of the intellect in discriminating convictions, that heads towards reflective unity, and that's grounded in the unitive function of Catholic and Jesuit higher education. I'm sorry to leave out a quotation from my colleague Eric Schmidt and a further remark on the relation of the curriculum to extracurricular activities. And I've also cut, you'll be happy, a final illustration of economism in the classroom, but this illustration is only my own self-chosen one as it plays into my hand. No doubt all of us have illustrations of our own, signifying both where we're succeeding, but also where we might fall down. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel once wrote that there is no view from nowhere. What we really confront is a motley ensemble of perspectives, all of which deserve to be heard out in respectful dialogue. But the danger to be averted under the penalty of betrayal would be our collective deterioration into a Tower of Babel, a breakdown in the unity of hearts and minds so ruinous that the one party can no longer understand what the other party is saying. I propose that the only way we can avert this danger with integrity is to reaffirm our essential commitment to the Catholic intellectual tradition and take active responsibility to assure that it's not hidden under a bushel in the life of the Gonzaga community. We are a light to the world and the salt of the earth, not through our own doing, but through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. In his UN address, John Paul II placed his preponderant emphasis on dialogic respect for the reality of difference, cross-culturally, inclusively, and universally. But of course, this affirmation is predicated on our unqualified respect for the reality of difference in the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is the only possible reason for our being a Catholic and Jesuit university in the first place. The only alternative is inauthenticity.
I found Tom's paper very thought-provoking, and I agree with almost everything he has to say. So what I'd like to do is share some of the thoughts that he's provoked as I read it. First, it's important to understand the nature and status of the statement of affirmation, which has been argued about on listservs. The statement of affirmation is a document written by the President with the aid of the Vice President for mission and approved by the Board of Trustees. It is addressed to the regional Jesuit provincial. It informs the Jesuits on how the university understands its Jesuit character and what it is prepared to commit itself to in order to remain true to that character. So, it should not be seen as a descriptive document of who we actually are, but a normative one, even an aspirational one. It should be evaluated in terms not of whether or not Gonzaga complies, but with how well or how poorly it complies in each of the document's various sections. It was not written by the faculty, nor was it submitted for their approval. It does not express a faculty consensus. It is not designed for PR purposes. In fact, the university did not even need to make it public. All Jesuit universities has been asked to write one of these. For many, it's an internal document between the president as head of the apostolic work and the provincial of the province. It's Thane who has made it a public document and even disseminated it for comment by faculty, staff, and administration prior to its being signed. Thane and Pat Lee, the current provincial, have really taken the lead in this effort among Jesuit higher education. Ours is the first written, and it will serve as a model for other Jesuit universities. Indeed, it goes further than some Jesuit universities, particularly the R1 research universities, are prepared to commit to. Statement of affirmation covers many aspects of the university's operation, including the hiring of Jesuits, issues raised by Ex Corde Ecclesiae, Fides et Ratio, as well as Covenbach, the former General of the Society, his Santa Clara address, and the current Jesuit General Superior Adolfo Nicolas's most recent Mexico City address, both of which are authoritative statements on the nature of Jesuit education for Jesuits. But a particular concern for us today is Gonzaga's commitment to the teaching of the Catholic intellectual tradition, its social teachings, and how it spells these out. Beginning with Martha Nussbaum's article comparing Notre Dame and BYU as religious universities was particularly thought-provoking for me. It illustrated for me in dramatic fashion the central differences between the approach of an outside observer to a tradition and that of an internal participant. As an outside observer, Nussbaum seeks to achieve as clear and distinct an understanding of what makes a Catholic university Catholic as she can. And by clear, I mean a delineation presumed to be agreed upon by all Orthodox members, and by distinct, I mean sharp boundaries between what's in and what's out. On the contrary, on the other hand, as an internal participant in the Catholic university tradition, I'm engaged in an ongoing argument amongst other participants about what our identity should be. What should make a Catholic university Catholic? Thus, in contrast to a clear definition, I see the issue as inherently conflictual, as a disputed question, you might say. My understanding, I see as part of a broader, ongoing argument by all participants on what makes a Catholic university Catholic. So too, as a participant, boundaries will be inevitably contested. Others might try to sideline or even exclude me as heterodox, and I may argue that they ought to be sidelined or expelled. All participants claim to be Orthodox. After all, they are making claims about what the defining essence of the tradition is. But others may claim that one or other interlocutor should be ruled out of bounds. So my argument is the Catholic intellectual tradition is an inherently conflictual reality. It's a living reality rather than an objective reality. Whereas people outside the tradition, I think, are more concerned in coming up with a common consensus understanding of what that tradition is. Hopefully, the statement of affirmation identifies topics of importance more than specific schools of thought for addressing what makes the Catholic university Catholic. For example, faith and reason, faith and justice, finding God in all things, human dignity, rather than, say, Augustinianism, or Thomism, or Lonerganianism, or Charles Taylorism, to be my own favorite, or process, just to name a few, with advocates in our own department. And so too, as I've already mentioned, the statement of affirmation identifies authoritative documents governing Catholic universities. Those in positions of governance would prefer obedience to them, that is unquestioning and blind, but most Catholic academics would see this as a betrayal of our role in the university, in the community, which is in part to challenge and prod the church into thinking about things it would seem easier to ignore. So within this internal argument, within the Catholic community about what its identity is and what its essential values are, there's also going to be argument about what weight to accord to what voice or office in the community. The Pope and the bishops govern the church. That's their vantage point. Catholic academics are very rarely bishops, and bishops are very rarely academics. There's a division of labor here. Outsiders may tend to see theologians as representatives of the tradition, or that they should be representatives of the tradition, and so should agree. Those in positions of governance may want to see them as spokesmen for the tradition. Theologians themselves tend to think of themselves as explorers and prophets in the tradition. As Benedict, who spent a long time policing theologians, put it to the Jesuits, we should be on the frontiers, where nobody else can go, or where nobody else wants to go. Frontiers that are inherently contested, and it's only to be expected. He says this, and it's only to be expected that we will at times be seen as threats by those charged with maintenance and governance. The one area where I disagree with Tom, and where I disagree with David, actually, and which is the defining principle of the Socratic Club, not to put too fine a point on it, is this faith in the full intelligibility of being and the mandate that is to believe to follow from that faith, the mandate to follow the argument wherever it leads. If by intelligibility we mean intelligible by finite human intellects, I would even rule this out of bounds as heterodox. For even should beings be ultimately intelligible to us, it's a defining characteristic of the Catholic tradition that God cannot be. But if we do not mean intelligible by humans, then whatever could we mean by that term? How could we understand what we mean by that term? But putting that to one side, the commitment to follow the argument wherever it leads, I think, is itself a secularizing move and a threat to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Let me explain why I think this way. Take physicalism, for example. I agree with Tom that physicalism is incompatible with the Catholic understanding of reality. I believe God suffuses nature. The Catholic intellectual tradition articulates that suffusion of God in nature through its sacramental vision of finding God in all things. But a priori, the scientific method cannot track God's presence, let alone understand it. God is not a scientific concept. Grace is not a physical force in nature. So what if I'm confronted with an argument for physicalism that I don't know how to rebut? What if I cannot find a flaw in the argument of an outsider who rejects what I define myself by? Am I to follow the argument in such a case? If I am committed to the tradition, not if I'm committed to the tradition. So if I'm committed to the tradition, I should not follow the argument if it leads to my leaving the tradition. Rather, it becomes a project to seek a rebuttal. But what if I never find a satisfying rebuttal? Even one that satisfies me, let alone satisfies my adversaries. Does my intellectual integrity call for me to concede? In short, does my intellectual integrity call for me to be able to refute all objections that have been raised against my commitment? In other words, do I have to be the smartest guy in the room? Do I have to be smarter than Daniel Dennett to not be a physicalist? I learned this from Kierkegaard. He argues that if you demand objective truth, your faith will always be in suspense. Even if you can't refute all objections, even if you can refute all objections to date, who knows what kind of objection tomorrow will bring. So in such a situation, to follow the argument wherever it leads would lead me out of the Catholic faith altogether. What we need then is not only smart Catholics, but committed Catholics who are not going to cut and run whenever the intellectual going gets rough. So this would be an argument for the need for a critical mass of Catholic faculty in the university. I'm at a loss as to how we would actually achieve any such percentage. So there's a lot of unknowns out there. Hiring regulated by quotas have had a poor history in higher education. But further, if the mission of the Catholic University is to bring faith and contemporary reason, i.e. science and culture, into dialogue, as Buckley's vision calls for, and as Ex Corde calls for, we will need people steeped in both traditions. And we will need everyone to be able to enter into the conversation with both. Okay? So we're going to need people who are steeped in Catholicism, we're going to need people steeped in the sciences, We're going to need people steeped in the humanities. We're going to need people, perhaps, steeped in physicalism. But they have to be people who can enter into conversation with the other side. So physicalists who have no use for religion have no place, in my view, in a Catholic university. The last thing we need is for students to be faced with arguments they can't rebut against their commitments. So I agree with Ex Corde calling for a critical mass, but I don't know where the percentage lies, and I'm not sure how to achieve it. Let me end. So this is only tangentially related. Let me end, but you caught it on again, so that got my gander up.
It did. It did.
Let me end by saying that faith in Jesuit education, remaining Catholic, despite the bad record of Unitarian and Congregational universities such as Harvard and Yale, this faith of mine is not a prediction, it's a commitment. As when I entered the Jesuits, or some of you got married, I did not make a prediction, I took a vow. What is most important for us is to learn what is necessary to keep that commitment strong and vibrant, and what we need to remain faithful to our vows.
Questions, please.
Let me make a comment about his paper. It seems like you're identifying the Catholic intellectual tradition with having a solid core curriculum, at least in part, a necessary condition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it got me thinking about all of these things. There's been a conversation on campus about it.
Okay, right, sure.
More of a comment thing instead of a question. Part of the reason that drew me here to the school was,
Speak up.
part of what drew me to the school was the religion and the philosophical groundings of the core curriculum. After 20 years in the military, and you see what goes on around, and you deal with people who have very high education but no exposure, they always are at risk. They always have a chink in the armor that tends to bring them down without some form of grounding that both philosophy and religion both bring to the table. And being engineering, the engineers are, from my experience, dealing with the ones most in need of those core curricula. And they're both very important, but on the other hand, that's the group that likes to challenge the most. But when it comes to the argument, you have to stand up for beliefs, but there's a point where you can't explain faith to a secularist who's in denial. And when they go into denial, they tend to be very fundamentalist in behavior, and they refuse to listen. So usually there's no discussion or transfer of thoughts or ideas, because they tend to be more closed-minded than those of my religious friends. So it's an odd paradigm to be around or see.
Thank you for that comment.
I'm trying to stand up. I don't stand up very well.
Oh, fun, Craig.
Tim, you put the focus on commitment, and I think that's correct. But can you equate commitment with every Catholic on campus or a certain number of Catholics on campus? I think the question is, when we hire somebody, whether they're committed to the values the university espouses, especially in its mission statement. And this could be somebody that's not, doesn't come under the label of Catholic, but who shares our fundamental commitments. Would you make that distinction?
Well, I would make 2 points. First is, I think it's If it is going to be the church entering into dialogue with culture, we need people from the church in the discussion. So I do think there needs to be a critical mass of people who are actually practicing Catholics. And I have no idea how to achieve that, because we can't ask them. But if it's actually going to be a conversation, we also need people who are steeped in all these areas of culture, and I don't think we need to stack the deck by insisting that they all be practicing Catholics. So that leads to a rather parochial discussion where a lot of questions don't get raised. So sure, we need people who aren't Catholics, but how we hire people, I think it's got to be based on commitment to mission values, and that can't be seen simply in the abstract. So it can't be, say, commitment to truth. Who is it? And it can't simply be a commitment to justice. And it has to be something about a willingness to cultivate the faith of our students. I mean, it doesn't have to be real directly, but it can't be undermining the faith of our students, in my view, even if you are committed to that being the truth. So I do think it's not just the criteria are substantive and not just formal conceptual criteria. So there could be a person who is well suited to some state university or Harvard, who is not well suited to Gonzaga.
Dr. Jeannot, I'm going to ask you a question that you probably have been waiting decades for.
I don't know if you're going to set it up like that. I'm not so
Comment
sure.
on publicly. We are a unitary whole here at Gonzaga University, but there is an identity of tradition which describes us and provides our normative and aspirational anchor as well. What do you think the identity of a Catholic Jesuit business school should look like? You're welcome.
Yeah. Can I call you on Sunday? It's a really contentious question, because in the longer version of the paper, I quote a student who was, I would say, the best student or tied for best that I had in 2 sections of ethics in the fall, who wrote a brief essay on Nietzsche, whose concluding paragraph was outright libertarianism, just to put it out on the table. Calling himself both a Catholic and also a devotee of Ayn Rand, which I don't think is an unknown phenomenon, and certainly not in the school of business, where a neoclassical paradigm of economics prevails. So that I try to make the argument that the political philosophy that best meshes with economics as a science, neoclassical, is libertarianism. But that that 1-2 punch is inconsistent with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I don't think it would be logically impossible to reconcile them, but I think it'd be extraordinarily difficult. Now then, I don't spend much time in the school business, and I honestly don't know very much about the initiatives that are being undertaken in the school right now, but I hear echoes that there are many mission-related initiatives underway in the School of Business Administration. And I was certain, I mean, if I was speaking to, I remember there are political scientists here, so I'm already uneasy. If there were economists in the room, you know, the first thing I'd like to say is, hey, I'm just a country boy from Spokane, you know. But I'm trying to put arguments for them. And I mean them as provocations and challenges. In other words, that the neoclassical economist and the libertarian, from Rand Paul to Alan Greenspan, does have something to think about with respect to any number of questions, but prominently including the question about the Catholic social teaching. But I know that there are a lot of thoughtful people over there at the Jefferson Center. I walked in there the other day. And I was, oh gosh, I've already taken way too much time, but I've been paranoid all week, and so I've been having trouble falling asleep. And so I thought with just a shift of the kaleidoscope, and you could get this by just compiling take notice from one day to another. There are beaucoup initiatives all over our campus, opportunities every single day. And I can tell you what got me vexed, but maybe I should. I would say that it is incumbent upon the School of Business Administration to be acutely aware of what the social teaching is of the Roman Catholic Church, and also to be responsive to it with respect and sensitivity and grace. But I wouldn't ask anybody to, I'd be the last person on earth to ask us all to fall together into a consensus. Because I've been allowed to get away with murder for 34 years as a matter of academic freedom. So I don't think that's the way to proceed. And I don't want to single you out personally, but I'm going to, because you were for many years a member of my own department, as you might recall. And weathered us through some difficult storms. And I don't think you would mind me saying out loud here that you yourself are not a confessional Roman Catholic. But if somebody were to ask me, does Steverson belong to the Catholic intellectual tradition, I would answer yes. And I am actually prepared to answer that question. So that's why I wanted to be clear. I am prepared, but I won't do it now. But if anybody wants to know, send me an email. And I have to have your permission before I send that message off to what?
You've always had carte blanche.
Okay. So I feel like a very delicate balancing act. But what I'm institutionally concerned about, this is what tripped my trigger. It seems to me that in culture and society, there's a diminution of the place of philosophical and theological investigation. But that philosophical and theological investigations do have a home. And their home is the campus of the Catholic University, while meanwhile the very trends that diminish the pride of place of philosophy and theology have become a presence on our own campus. And, you know, I'm not going to speculate about why any further here, but apparently it's so. Or in other words, a lot of us here wouldn't know the Catholic intellectual tradition if it ran us over in the parking lot. And there is a need to make it known. And the thing that I was most nervous about, just between you and me, was that I wanted to end by appealing to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in a public forum such as this one. Because it was an act, to talk like a Jesuit, of agere contra. Because sometimes you walk around this place and you almost feel embarrassed. Say, I'm a Catholic. I agree with Michael Buckley about Christ as paradigm. I don't have an a priori hostility to the teaching of the church, even though my understanding of it may not align with somebody else's, because I think there are 3 magisteria, and, you know. But these are the kinds of conversations that I think we're starving for on our campus, despite all of the extracurricular opportunities. So that I took a kind of something about the diction of the academic vice president's recent memorandum on the process of implementing the new core curriculum. And there's a sentence there that says, beyond academics. Okay? Now, I know she doesn't mean this, and she's not here, but the sentence reads like this. This is semantically and syntactically how it's structured. And it's the only place in her memorandum to the community where spirituality and faith development are mentioned. And to me, that's an index. That's a canary in the mine, frankly, just to put it like that. No, it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the work that we're doing. That faith development belongs integrally to the task of the core curriculum. But we're not a parish, and we're not catechists, and we're not propagandists. So we have to approach this question in an intellectually serious way. But it's a question that we have to approach in our classrooms. And I envision am I being responsive?
Entirely.
Okay. And then as I say, since you give me an inch and I take a mile, I've already, eaten too much at the buffet, so, mix up metaphors like that. That's my answer to your question. But I don't think anybody should be embarrassed or afraid to acknowledge that being affiliated with Gonzaga University means standing in some affirmative and respectful relationship to the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I think that tradition is in jeopardy in intellectual culture in the United States of America today.
And just to embarrass Brian, and in further response to Mike Cook, I think he's a very good example of how you don't have to be Catholic to be part of the mission. I mean, Brian engages.
You're right.
I'm responding to your question about whether everybody's got to be Catholic by my understanding of mission. And I think people like Brian, who are perfectly schooled in the Catholic intellectual tradition, they're the kind of people that can have this kind of conversation and that can have this kind of dialogue. And it's probably better that he's not Catholic because it keeps the discussion for free and parochial. But what I'm resisting would be the view that let's get the best business ethicists in the country, and that would be our top choice if we could only do that. And I worry that following the argument wherever it leads more to that kind of logic. Well, let's get the smartest guy in the room.
Tim, sometimes when you've been talking to me, you make a distinction between doctrinal Catholic and practicing Catholic, and maybe it helps to think about two different kinds of diversity. Diversity between Catholics and non-Catholics is an important diversity to cultivate, but I've really been convinced by your argument that to talk about practicing Catholics itself cultivates diversity within the tradition, because you're not asking about affirmation of certain kind of doctrinal claims. You can have a great diversity of theological views within, so diversity within the Catholic tradition, within practicing Catholics, as well as diversity across Catholic and non-Catholic traditional lines. Would you find that to be right?
I think I'm absolutely right.
You're okay.
Are we fielding questions?
Yeah, let's field in the questions.
Let me go to Henning, and then our distinguished colleagues up front, Professor Vacher and Professor Weiserson.
So a short question, then maybe a longer question. The short one is, do you think the recent rhetoric regarding excellence school is going to be, I forget the exact language that President McCullough is using now, but we want to be an excellent liberal arts school or among the nationally, among the best. So I'm just curious if this is an instance of your argument, Dr. Jeannot, would you take that as an example of the being famous problem?
Maybe. I think it'd be better for us to be second rate and keep the imago Dei in mind, and admit people from a much richer diversity of class and racial backgrounds, and just say, look, you know, we're only Gonzaga, but we have, you know, if those are in tension with one another, which wouldn't necessarily be the case, Tim's point here is something I'm going to have to think about. But I have these Warnerdian commitments, so except that we should, let's have another meeting in which we discuss this thesis that being is completely intelligent. And we can, you know, leave it to one side today.
I hate the word
I
excellence.
love Critchlow's example of this St. Mary's Law School in San Antonio, which is a fourth-tier law school, but which has a faith-based mission.
Okay, I thought I was begging for you to use that as an example, but I perhaps want you to be more controversial than you want to. So, second other question
And our philosophy department is excellent.
relates to the longer document you sent out to the faculty right after final exams. And there you were arguing a position regarding sort of, I don't know if you would disagree with the characterization, saying that we're in a moment of crisis regarding mission at the school. And what worries me is that I am not worried about it in the way that you are, and I worry because I worry that I should be worrying in the way that you are. So I've only been here for 6 years, so I have a limited window of analysis to compare to and past experiences. So I spoke to somebody who'd been here for more than 40 years and asked him whether he agreed, and he said that he thought that it was not particularly any worse, maybe better than it was in the past, that the conversations are, from his perspective, more common, more prevalent, more opportunities. And so I just wanted to give you another opportunity to think through, and both of you really, I'm curious, sort of, it bothers me that I don't see the crisis, and again, I know that's a strong word, I don't see that in that strong of terms. So are you still convinced of that? And without spending the next 35 minutes, could you
That would be impossible, so I'm yielding to time.
Okay.
I think it is a crisis, but in the sense of a critical moment, not in the sense of, boy, things are really going to hell. But it's a fluid moment where there's room to maneuver. And I would say I've been associated with Gonzaga in one way or another for 40 years, and I have never heard as much argument about mission as in the last couple. And that's a good thing, right? So if by crisis you mean things are in the toilet, no, in the 70s everyone had perhaps a much stronger consensus and nobody cared. Right? Today, people care.
And so I guess I like that. I only want to add a comment. Having experienced a school that was trying to do quotas for faculty and having left in part because of it, I didn't come out of there necessarily of the opinion that a critical mass of actual Catholics is unimportant, although I didn't start there. But I do think that it's really, really hard to do well, and much harder than people realize, and dangerous to do poorly. So I'm glad to hear you say you don't have the answers, but I worry about people who think they do. Even though I share your view that we should have
Jim or Mike, either one?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I may be trying to get you in trouble, so be aware of that.
Oh, okay,
More than you already are.
okay.
Let's pick a date, this is my premise, say 1975, and compare Gonzaga in 1975 to a small village,
Yes.
and in 2014, a major corporation. Can you comment at all on any connection between that transformation, as I see it, and the message that you're bringing us today?
Yes, and